Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group. Lastly, at this point then, I did want to introduce our co-chairs, Lewis and David, as well as our guest chair, Kent Kyle, coming back for another month as we get going with a second part of Specifying Paint.
Well, thanks very much,
good
Matt.
afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone.
Go ahead, Lewis.
We had a tremendous response from our audience last month on paints and coatings, and asking for more detail about a couple of the areas that we covered. Last month's we started out with a lot of generic stuff, and it was all good stuff, but it wasn't, we didn't get quite enough depth. And so I was able to persuade Kent to come back. And we're going to look at basically two areas today. We're going to look at the different binders, the different types of paints as classified by the binder, and the pros, the advantages of the ones and their limitations and where you might want to use them. And we're going to go through that fairly quickly so that we can spend the bulk of the time talking about the MPI, Master Painters Institute method of specifying paints and coatings. So Kent is the local representative for PPG paints and glass, and he is a certified construction product representative, CCPR, and is active on the certification committee at the national level. So, David, you want to say hi to the folks?
Well, certainly. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm on the road again today, so hopefully everything goes well. Coming to you from Kent Island in Maryland, getting ready for the big day for my daughter, who's getting married this weekend. So we're already here and trying to get ourselves settled.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So, as I said, we're going to talk briefly about the types of binders, which is the way that paints and coatings are classified, and what their properties are, what their uses are, and what some of the limitations of the different types are, because some of them are really good for certain things but have weaknesses that make them less than desirable for other uses. So we're going to turn this over to Kent and let him talk to us about acrylic paints.
Well, thank you, Lewis. For those of you that were with us last month, we kind of ran through this quickly. So some of this information may seem or be the same as what you saw last month. Some of the questions that we were getting is where to use these systems. So let's just briefly go through some of the benefits of them, and then we'll get into where to use these particular systems or products. Excellent exterior color retention, great place to be using 100% acrylic paints, excellent exterior gloss retention, and a breathable film. As we just talked about last month, that breathability factor is extremely important.
So that allows the wall to dry, if it has any moisture in it, to dry out through the paint coating.
Exactly.
And not all paint coatings have that ability.
I got a phone call from a painting contractor here in Nashville yesterday. We've had about 3 or 4 days of steady rain. It dried up a little bit yesterday, but he called me up and was complaining because he had blisters all over the outside of a house that he was doing, and it was an acrylic paint system he was using on the outside of the house. For anybody who's ever ran into that, that breathability factor is part of that, because vapor barrier can build up behind these fresh films, and you can get moisture behind collecting. But if you have those kind of blisters, leave them alone, let the sun come out, dry the film out, and it will normally rebond to the surface quite nicely, and you'll really never know that you ever had any blisters there. Worst case scenario, if you have a heavy moisture content, they may sag some and you may have to do a little scraping and sanding, but that is an example of that breathability factor. They can be used on most exterior substrates. It's really a good go-to product for most exterior surfaces, especially when we're getting into masonry surfaces and so on, and we'll talk about that in another
Now,
So,
the DTM products,
yes.
do they require a primer? Or is that the point they can go on without a primerless, just 2 coats of?
You can put them over a shop coat primer. If the steel comes in, if you have doors and frames, things of that nature, if they come on the job site and they have a factory primer on there, you can go directly to that with a DTM primer, a DTM finish coat. I'm kind of old school when it comes to this kind of thing because I'm a primer to finish coat kind of guy. That's one of my favorite methodologies to specify around is primer to finish coats. You do get some benefits in prime coats, and with the DTM primers, some of them have rust inhibitors in them, some of them don't. You need to be a little bit careful about that and make sure you're looking at the data page and asking the questions. But if you do put a prime coat on there, you're normally getting extra coat of rust inhibitive value on that surface. So with directed metals, I do like to use a primer and to finish coat, even over factory primer, because a lot of those factory primers are kind of skinny coated anyway, and this just gives you that extra durability factor that you can build into your paint system.
Now, would you use an acrylic paint on galvanized metal, say gutters and downspouts?
Most definitely. Galvanized is one of those kind of things. There are a few solvent-based finishes, normally they're cementitious solvent-based primers that you can use on galvanized, but a safe rule of thumb is to use latex or use acrylic paint on galvanized.
Tell us where we might want to use an elastomeric acrylic paint.
Well, elastomeric acrylic paint is good where you're going to have wind-driven rain, coastal areas where you're concerned about moisture getting through the surface. You want a heavy film build of coating on the surface. Elastomerics kind of are a dicey situation. They get used a lot of places. I think that they don't necessarily need to be used. High-build acrylic systems will do a very good job in most situations on most masonry surfaces, and I would kind of reserve elastomerics to where you really do need that wind-driven rain resistance aspect of things.
But it will stretch a little bit to cover up hairline cracks.
Yep.
And one of the places I used it was my previous firm had a masonry building that was built in 1871 that had some parging, cementitious parging on the exposed wall that was 4 stories high, and there were no control joints or anything. And so we used the product on that because the building moves a little bit and so forth. David, I think you wanted to speak?
Yeah, so Ken, we had a couple of questions. Maybe we can deal with these now. But one thing I wanted to ask you to point out is you're talking about 100% acrylics and not, say, a vinyl acrylic blend.
Yes.
Just to be certain that everybody understands that there may not, just because it says acrylic, it may not be 100% acrylic.
And that's a good point, David. Yeah, we talked about that. I guess I'm kind of relying a little bit on what we talked about last month, because vinyl acrylic is another kind of latex paint, but it's a vinyl resin and an acrylic resin blended together. Those particular products, there are and have been some of those that are exterior products. Mostly vinyl acrylics are used interiorly. They do a great job interior. They're not as UV ultraviolet light resistant as 100% acrylic is. So, but you can get flatter flats with a vinyl acrylic, and it has some really good benefits for interior usage. But whenever we're talking about exterior, the 100% acrylic paints will really do a better job for you in an exterior environment. And the vinyl acrylics, again, will give you the wider range of sheens, can get to dead flats for interior paint. But I would be a little cautious in using those, actually be a lot cautious in using those in an exterior environment, because a vinyl acrylic paint can chalk on you in an exterior environment where that's not something you normally have with 100% acrylic paint. Chalking is not a common factor with 100% acrylic paint.
Okay, we had a question from Ron Ray asking about the cure time for DTM coatings. Isn't it somewhat lengthy?
Well, you know, that's a really good question, seeing how we're sitting here with 40-some degree temperatures in Nashville today. It can extend in the fall periods of time. Some DTM acrylics do have a tendency to take longer to cure. There have been some good headway made in not having that situation be the case so much. But I would get with your paint manufacturer and take a look at the DTMs, especially going into the fall season, to make sure that what you're using does have maybe, if not a cold cure capability, at least have the ability to cure out in cooler temperatures.
Right. And one last one here, and then we can let you go on to the alkyds. Robert Bauman is asking, what is your opinion on the new paints that contain primer and finish coats in the same container? Or I guess self-priming type coatings.
Yes, and I think the primer and paint all in one type situation has its place. Especially drywall would be a great place to use those kind of finishes. Be quite honest with you, and I think we stated this last month, that with acrylic paints and latex paints as a general classification, a 3-coat system of those things, you could have done this forever. The paint primer in one type situation tends to be some marketing aspect of it to a certain degree, because you've been able to take 3 coats of latex paint, put them on bare drywall, and get a relatively decent finish forever. The only issue is that finish coats tend to be a little more expensive than what prime coats are. So if you use a primer and 2 finish coats, you may be able to save yourself a little bit of money in terms of material cost by doing that, if you don't mind changing out your roller cover or cleaning up your roller cover and switching to finish coat from prime coat. But if you like one bucket, all one size fits all, for drywall particularly, that's great. But if you'll take a look at the side of the bucket, there are prime coats normally recommended for other substrates on that primer and paint primer in one type finish coat. So make sure that you're doing your due diligence and reading the label before you actually grab a bucket and head for your job site, because there are some mitigating circumstances in some of those products.
Okay, great, thanks. Moving on.
So where would we want to use alkyds in particular? Would we want to use alkyd paints on exterior hollow metal doors and frames?
You can.
Or would acrylic acrylic enamels be better?
Well, I'm a real fan of the DTM acrylics. But as one of the listeners, question was in terms of cold temperatures, this would be a good time of year to kind of, again, take a look at the DTM products and not to overdo them. Interior, they're great year-round. You could use the alkyd products would be good this time of year. It'd be good pretty much any time of year. Any place where you need a hard, durable finish.
One of the places that I've always liked to specify alkyd paints on the interior in particular is doors and frames, because they get handled so much. And with acrylic paints, you can get some softening, and they seem to pick up the oils from people's hands and soil more, and they don't have quite the same cleanability.
And you are spot on with that. I would totally agree with you. And even with the new waterborne alkyds, you still have that hardness of finish, and they are resistant to hand oils and the chipping effects that you get from bracelets and rings and dinging the surface and so on. So that would be a good place. Again, those doors and frames, a DTM acrylic or a alkyd product would be fine in that circumstance.
Interior stairs, metal stairs,
handrails, things of that nature. We use them sometimes on walls, we use them sometimes on masonry surfaces, depending upon what we want to achieve. And there again, this goes back to something that I'll say time and again, is it depends, because there's more than one way to write a paint system depending upon what you want that surface, what kind of protective value you want on that surface, and then what kind of maintenance aspect of it you want for that surface. We could help write specifications for 5-year repaint system, 10-year repaint systems, and so on, depending upon what your owner wants to achieve in terms of maintenance.
All right. Next is epoxies, which we all like because they are resistant to a wide variety of chemicals, and they seem to be a little more, once they get cured out, are more neutral chemically in terms of being less vulnerable to things. Originally, most epoxies were 2-part, and they were difficult to apply. But why don't you talk to us a little bit about, are there still uses for the two-component epoxies, that places where we would want to use those instead of a single component epoxy?
Yeah, and depending upon what we want to achieve, again, it's going to really depend whether we use a two-component epoxy or whether we use a pre-catalyzed acrylic epoxy, or we have some new versions of a single pack epoxy where you have the part A and the part B in the same bucket, where the part B is encapsulated in solvent, and whenever you put it up on the surface, whenever you roll or spray it to the surface, as that solvent disappears, then it catalyzes on the surface. That's a brand new technology that's being utilized, and I think you'll see more of that coming to market. But the epoxy systems as a standard family just do give you some durability factor that you won't get out of single component products of a similar nature. We had some questions about touching up epoxy last month, and hopefully we got those answered to everybody's satisfaction. But with epoxy systems, they're a very durable, very useful system. We have polyamide epoxies, we have amine epoxies. There's multiple different ones that we use. In commercial construction, and probably places where most of our audience would be writing specifications, polyamide epoxies would be a really good thing, probably one of the better products to use. They're easy to catalyze. They're normally a 1-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio to mix together. They do have a pot life, and they do, after so many hours, then they've lost their pot life and can't continue to use them. But they do have good range of color. Whenever you're getting into the amine epoxies and on into the other ranges of epoxies, you sometimes lose very much color ability. You might have a red oxide above, so on, but you don't really have a full range of colors. So that's one thing with the polyamide epoxies, will give you that. And you can use them in most areas. We have wet areas here, shower rooms, wall areas, kitchen areas, kennels, frequent wash down areas. And there are different epoxies. We have high build epoxies that might be better for some of these wash down areas than just a single polyamide epoxy might be. So it really is dependent upon what your needs are as to how we put these things together. And again, we're talking about finish coats here. I don't want to underestimate or underscore the value. I do want to underscore the value, I should say, of using epoxy primers and using appropriate primers in surface preparation to go along with these finish coats.
Block filler.
Block filler. That's a really good one right there. And the block filler is not just latex block filler. We do have we have epoxy block fillers. We have epoxy ester block fillers. We have cementitious epoxy ester block fillers that can do a really good job of waterproofing a CMU wall. We were talking about elastomerics a minute ago. 2 coats of a waterproofing polyamide or wall-proofing epoxy ester block filler and a coat of elastomeric can do a great job of waterproofing a CMU wall.
Some years ago, I did a detention facility, a juvenile detention facility, and we actually specified 2 coats of block filler.
Yep.
Because we wanted to absolutely minimize the surface indentations, the variations that could hold dirt and grease and grime and so forth, and it turned out really very nice.
Well, there's some cementitious acrylic blends that you can actually purge the surface of the wall with and pretty much take the joint lines out of the wall and then come back with a couple coats of epoxy on that and have a very attractive wall and get a very durable surface over a CMU wall.
One of our...
Yes.
Oh, we've got a couple of questions. You've opened up a box here for epoxy. So let me see if I can get them. From Tom Broads, what are the recommendations for putting epoxies on drywall?
It really kind of depends on drywall. A water-based epoxy, a 2-component polyamide water-based epoxy would be a good system over. I like to use 100% acrylic primer just so you get some better holdout with epoxy finishes, but that would do very well. You don't necessarily have to use a solvent-based epoxy these days. We do have water-based, 2-component water-based epoxies, and then there are new single-component pre-catalyzed epoxy ester, not epoxy ester, let me get my terminology straight, acrylic epoxy systems that you can use too. And again, it's dependent upon what you want to achieve on that drywall. We can get a very moisture-resistant finish on the drywall, but then drywall is not going to necessarily be very moisture-resistant in and of itself. So it depends, again, what you want to accomplish with the system.
Well, the other thing is that I always think about when putting epoxies on gypsum board is that you're putting a very hard, inflexible coating on a surface that is basically flexible in between the studs.
Yeah, you'll still get enough, I think, enough flexibility. I've really never ran into an issue where drywall was ever, it ever was an issue with epoxy being able to stick to it or getting any kind of undulations or any issues going on with the finish on the drywall.
Now, Kent, when you say that epoxies can yellow with age, is that interior or is that only the exterior?
It'll yellow with age interior too.
So that might affect color selections.
It can to a certain degree. There really is no such thing as a white epoxy. Most of us, whenever you take a look at a color sheet, if you have a color card or whatever, there will be some kind of I've never seen pure white listed on epoxy. I have seen porcelain white, and I have seen antique white, and I have seen numerous names of that nature.
Almond and
yeah, exactly. Okay. But that's just part of the process.
A couple of questions for you about floors and relating to epoxies. That's a whole other specifying hour.
The man wants to come back.
There's just a lot that goes into that. But go ahead. What's your question?
Okay, so the question from Ken Hersenberg was asking about slip resistance and cleanability, but along with that is another question from Frank Callis, who says, are epoxies good for floors, and will they have better wear qualities?
And yes, to a large extent, yes. There's a lot of epoxy flooring systems out there. Epoxies and floors are very dependent upon several things. And some of the questions that you need to ask when it comes to epoxy on floors, first and foremost, is there a vapor barrier underneath the slab? And if we get a yes answer to that, then we need to do a moisture check, either do calcium chloride checks, or even something as simple as taping down some that 2 foot by 2 foot piece of plastic to the floor, letting it dwell there for 24 hours, pulling the plastic up, checking is it darker underneath the plastic than it was around the surrounding floor. If we do have darkness underneath there, we probably need to actually get into the calcium chloride checks just to find out how much moisture we got in that slab. The last thing you want to have happen is to do an epoxy floor finish on a slab and then 3 or 4 months later end up going in taking up great big sheets of the stuff because you had moisture in that slab that was unaccounted for. And we were talking about breathability with acrylic finishes. Well, epoxies are a vapor barrier, and that moisture will build up behind there, and you can get enough hydrostatic pressure behind there to actually pop it off the floor.
We really do need to kind of move on today, but I think that is an excellent idea for a session sometime in the new year, is to talk about resinous flooring systems. So we'll put that on our to-do list. Polyurethanes. The thing that really impressed me about polyurethanes, I remember some years ago, about 30 years ago actually, when I first found out about them, the Tanemic salesman came by and he had 2 coupons of metal. They were identical color, and one was a really good acrylic enamel, the other one was polyurethane. He laid them side by side and took steel wool and ran back and forth. The alkyd scratched like crazy, and the polyurethane was essentially untouched.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of polyurethanes. They're a very nice product. They really are in terms of durability factor. If you want something that's extremely ultraviolet light resistant, very color retentive and gloss retentive in an exterior environment that you want to be that way for years and years and years, polyurethane is an excellent choice for that kind of thing.
I've used them. The firm I work for in Cincinnati did most of the work for the zoo that has, well over 1 million visitors every year. And on the areas where we wanted a color handrail as opposed to stainless steel, I used polyurethane top coat over a high build epoxy first coat, and they wear wonderfully because even the best conventional paint is going to get pinhole rusting in just a few years.
Excellent choice for that kind of thing. I love it on handrails. That is my go-to choice if I'm helping out with a specification for handrails and for things of that nature. There's just really not, but when it comes to steel, particularly, polyurethanes are one of the best that you can use. If you're looking at different levels, using epoxy primer and urethane finish coat, a couple coats of urethane on exterior environment, and you'll get a very, very durable system. The only thing our next slide up from there is polysiloxanes, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. You had something, David?
I liked your idea here. You mentioned the epoxy primer and the urethane finish coat, and that has really been our go-to system for corrosive environments anywhere along the eastern coast, Gulf Coast. So it's anything metal exterior that has any possibility of corrosion.
Well, and the other thing too, you have full range of color, and you can get into metallic finishes with these things. And you also have, in some polyurethanes, you have a satin available as well as having a gloss available. So with some of these catalyzed products, we don't have as much of a sheen range available as what we do have with some of the single component products like alkyds and acrylics. So with polyurethanes, we do have satins available, and there are some semi-gloss epoxies, but to come up with there are some flat epoxies, but those are normally prime coats and not finish coats. So if you look at that for sheen range as well as color, polyurethanes is a good choice for exterior.
Yep.
Okay, our next category up here is polysiloxanes, and this is a kind of a nice category because you get the benefits of epoxy and a urethane combined in one product. There are some new single component polysiloxane products that are coming to the market. One of the things is you get good volume solids with this, and when I say volume solids, we talked about that a little bit last month, but you get some good quality volume solids with this, with resin content as well as with quality pigment package in these polysiloxane materials. So you can use them on ferrous metal, galvanized metal, concrete, and high traffic areas, and you can use them direct to zinc surfaces without a prime coat. And again, get that benefit of about a 3-coat system in a 2-coat system because of the film build that you can get out of these. Now, I'm sorry.
When you go on a galvanized surface, you still do need to have some sort of wipe down with an etching material.
Yeah, I mean, the more profile we can get to the surface, the better off we're going to be.
Well, and remove any, because there's always a lot of residual grease and oils from the forming process, isn't there?
Right, and we need at least SP1 would be solvent wipe down. That goes along with the whole SSP, CSP systems. That's an absolute minimum is to get that wipe down. And then we prefer to have, either SP2, SP3 at minimum for some of these things to be able to get them to stick. If we can get some kind of a profile to that surface, the better. Because with any paint system, the better the surface preparation, the longer you're going to have that system hold up.
Kent and I are...
Yes.
I was going to ask, because you have the last bullet point on this slide versus last slide, isocyanate free, as opposed to contains isocyanates for the urethanes.
Correct.
What's the big deal?
Well, isocyanates are a chemical that you can get down into your lungs that can cause lung irritation. Whenever you're applying polyurethanes, there normally are requirements in terms of fresh air requirements or in terms of air-assisted air hoods and things of that nature when you're applying those kind of products. Isocyanates are a dangerous chemical component, and the MSDS page states that pretty clearly on things. Whereas, again, if you want to get away from that, or if you're on a work site that you want to keep it free of anything that could be of a hazard to any surrounding work people. That would be one way of doing it, is to move to a polysiloxane versus a polyurethane. Now, one thing about polyurethanes, we normally don't use polyurethanes interiorly. It's kind of a rare circumstance when we would, but on the rare occasions we'll use polyurethanes inside. Polysiloxanes are interior or exterior products. You can use them interiorly. Some of the solvent-based polysiloxanes will have an odor to them. And again, we haven't gotten into the whole VOC issue on paint too much here today, but they are lower, the VOCs, because you have higher volume solids with polysiloxanes. But that isocyanate thing is something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Great. So here's a question then from Dwayne F. Asking, are polyurethane and polysiloxane good finishes for cement board where we need good color retention?
Well, on cement board and things of that nature, I would go with 100% acrylic paints personally. Lewis mentioned something about hardness of finish, and with polyurethanes and with polysiloxanes, these are very hard finishes. And with cement board and so on, we need some flexibility in that, because normally those things are put on surfaces between studs and so on, so you do get some flex with that. So I would stay with 100% acrylic if I was looking at it for like a hardy plank or a cementitious board type siding.
One of the places where it is good, though, are the large exposed steel things that are going to be exposed for a long time, and you want good service life. Right now, Kent and I are speaking from a meeting room in our building that we're looking to the east, and we can see the Nissan Stadium where the Titans football team play, and their framework that hold up the lights is being repainted, perhaps for the first time, with polysiloxane, and they are doing a very juicy bright red.
Yeah, it's that red out there in the exterior environment, that's going to be a good thing to keep an eye on for the next several years.
Oh. And then fluoropolymer. Now, of course, most of the cases where we use fluoropolymer, these are factory applied, not even shop applied, because most of them, until fairly recently, had to be a form of baked enamel. It was thermoset. I've been through the line tech that does the work for Wausau up in Wisconsin to actually see how they do that. And one of the great things about the fluoropolymers is, for example, if you get coil-coated stock, they can wind it up on these big coils, unwind it, and make gutters and downspouts and copings and all kinds of things, because the coating will actually stretch a little bit, enough that it will do very fine. And of course, they have very, very good gloss and color retention for a long period.
That is one of the, when we're talking about the hierarchy of paint systems, fluoropolymers is getting up there to the tip top. That's you get into 20 plus years of service life expectancy. So it's not one of the less expensive systems when it comes to cost per gallon. Now, when it comes to cost per square foot per year of service, now these products have a really good story to tell. A lot of times paint gets looked at on how much is the cost per gallon, and you are looking at a significant cost per gallon in terms of fluoropolymer, but you're also looking at a significant life expectancy out of these kind of things. So if you don't want to have to go back in there and do much maintenance for 20 plus years, then fluoropolymer systems would be a good thing to look at.
Now, if I had an existing building, Kent, with a storefront or a curtain wall that had been originally painted with an acrylic enamel that's badly worn, would I want to use your field-applied, air-dry fluoropolymer, or would I want to use the polysiloxane to clean it up, dress it up, and get it looking good again?
Well, and you raise a good point there, Lewis, because depending upon what we're going on top of and depending upon what kind of surface prep you want to do, will depend upon what kind of paint system we might recommend to you. You could go back to fluoropolymers, but in that kind of situation, I think your surface preparation is going to get out of hand in terms of cost. for you to be able to move up to a fluoropolymer. So if you have an acrylic system on there to begin with, you may just want to go back with an acrylic system another time around. That's one of the things we have to look at, especially on storefronts and so on. If you had originally had a painted storefront and then you come back, we need to do some alcohol checks or try to figure out what kind of coating's on that surface before we make a recommendation. The last thing you want to do is to put a really, really good system over something that
lift.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lesser system underneath it and they haven't come on. So that's one of the aspects of looking at things. And again, one of the things I mentioned last month is to have somebody in the paint business that you can trust to help you either do field inspections on things or to help with advice on these kind of things, because especially for repainting and renovation work and so on, we need a lot of times see the field conditions to really understand what we're dealing with for new paint systems.
Well, when would we want to use a field applied fluoropolymer? What kinds of, where have you seen those applied?
A lot of exterior middle, the storefronts, the curtain wall on buildings. If you're going to redo a building exterior and you have a metal facade and a lot of glass on that building, we use these fluoropolymers a lot in that kind of circumstance. Or if you're repainting a roof, you're redoing roofs, fluoropolymers are a great system on roofs. We have a pretty broad range of color available. You don't necessarily get into the really bright colors with fluoropolymers, but there are some things that you can do there.
We really need to move on. But
yep. Hey, we had a couple things too. We had several people asking if the slides would be available for download. The whole presentation will be uploaded to YouTube for sure. Louis, are you going to make the slides available?
Yes, I will. I will email it to Matt, and he can disperse it at his convenience and leisure.
Okay.
So we had a lot of questions last time about MPI, Master Painter Institute, and let's see. I think I went too far. There we go. So we need to go through this fairly quickly because we're down to the last 20 minutes or so. But perhaps, Kent, you could give us a real quick background on where this thing came from, and then we'll talk about how it works.
Well, back several years ago, initially for government work, they worked around either mil specs or TTP and TTE specs. And some of those things, especially mil specs, were actually paint formulas that you had to either make the paint to that formulation, or we used systems that were called in lieu of systems for TTP and TTE specs. That got a little cumbersome, and it wasn't something that was easy to bid, and people, as such, were having some difficulty writing specifications using that system. And then the U.S. Navy got a hold of the MPI out of Canada and brought it into the United States as a system to work with them. And it kind of got picked up throughout the entire government and has become a standard for most government work now. So with that, it has become an integral part of what we do in the paint business. And they organize their systems based upon individual product number categories and interior and exterior paint systems. And so we'll get into some of that conversation and try to help sort out some of this, or give you some information where you can find more information about this, about MPI.
And I do know that my fingers got a little out of whack, and it is BSD spec link, not BDS.
Okay, yes. Hey, and Kent, we have a question asking you to explain what are TTP and TTE specs. Those are the Fed specs that replaced the military, are they not?
That was, yeah, the mil specs, the TTP and TTE specs were all, at one period of time, were all being used together. Matter of fact, some of that stuff's still floating around out there. You may run into some of that, but that was all basically specification information for government work. That's the way that they were writing their specifications. I know that in our lab, we had multiple books that had that information in there. And we also had a list at one point in time of in lieu of government specs that we used pretty heavily. But since the advent of MPI, I don't much run into TTP or TTE specs anymore.
So how does one of the things that people like about MPI is there's a certain level of objective evaluation of the products, but that's, of course, somebody has to pay for that.
Yes, and as paint manufacturers pay for that. We do pay every 3 years. We have to, or anytime we submit a product to MPI, then we pay a fee to get a product listed in an MPI category. MPI will review that. They will either review the information or they will do the testing of the product depending upon what the category is calling for, and they will either allow us into that category or not. Then we have to resubmit after a couple of years, or if the category's basic performance standards change, and then again there will be a resubmittal fee for such things. But we do fund MPI in the way that we put products into the categories. And if you paid attention, or if anybody has looked on the paintinfo.com website, MPI continues to grow the categories that they have in the part of the MPI system. But if you haven't visited the site, it's www.paintinfo.com. That's a free website. You can go out there. There's a lot of paint information out there. There's some good information on surface preparation. There's just a wealth of stuff out there if you want to go, peruse the entire site. But the big thing for it is that where you get the approved product list is out there. The APL is at the paintinfo.com site. So if you ever had have seen something where you had an MPI number 79 or something, you wonder what in the world that was, if you go to that paintinfo.com site, you can find that product category and see who all is listed in that category.
And here's a screenshot showing just that.
Okay, and Kent, while we're looking at that, here's a great question. I think this again from Dwayne F. asking, well, how do you integrate a non-participating manufacturer's info into an MPI-based spec?
Well, and that's a good question, and it really is dependent upon who the owner is and what they're going to allow for. If you are doing government work, at least the projects that I have worked on for the government, they want an MPI number on the product, they want it on the data page, and they want an MPI product. They do not like to or will allow for non-listed products to be part of their projects. If you are with a paint company that is not listed with MPI, and then there is a whole process to go through with MPI to become part of the system. There are over 50 some odd paint manufacturers that are listed by a product or more in MPI at this point in time.
And of course, not all the manufacturers make all the types of paints.
Yes, exactly. Not every manufacturer, I don't know of any manufacturer, quite honestly, that has every category filled. There's not a lot of reason for us to fill every category, quite honestly, but there are some work system or heavy work system numbers in there that we all have a category, we have a product in or more. That's one of the things about MPI is the fact that you don't just list one product per category. You can list multiple products per category. And that is, whenever we talk about pluses and minuses of MPI, that may be something we want to entertain.
So here's explain what we're seeing on this slide, Kent.
Okay.
What are the columns over here on the right?
Well, starting on the far left-hand column, obviously we have the paint manufacturer, and then we have the product name, and then we have a description of the product, and then the product number. And then we get into the E categories, E1, E2, E3, which helps to explain the environmental friendliness aspect of the product. If you see the little green leaf over on the far right-hand side, that will help to give you some identification as to the greenness or the VOC levels of the paint product. Now, there is a difference between LEED and there is a difference between MPI when it comes to green standards. So you may want to take some time, if you're doing a LEED project and writing around MPI, you want to take some time to understand the entirety of what MPI's green systems are versus LEED. There is a difference between those, and you can kind of get confused or get your painting contractor or get your bidders confused if you don't understand what you're writing into your specification.
There's two lines of check marks RG and L. What do those refer to? Right next to the E range.
Yeah, I'm looking at what you're talking about. Yeah, because truth of the matter, I'm on complete ignorance on that because I don't know if I've ever paid any attention to those two categories. Truth of the matter, most of the time when I'm in there looking at MPI categories, I'm looking for competing products and looking for alignment of products to see the equal value of them whenever I'm putting them into a specification.
Okay. Well, a few weeks ago, I was trying to update my paint spec all by myself, which was not overly successful. And I got into the MPI system because we're master spec subscribers, so it didn't cost anything. And I started picking some different substrates and what kinds of paints we wanted. And there's a system that they have that you can go in and answer like a questionnaire sort of thing and then crank it out. And this was actually in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. And you can see that the system code over here refers to the surfaces and in particular. And then the finished system, is it latex based, is it water based? There's one down at the bottom, WB, a different type of water based. Then we have the environmental condition and the type of finish and so forth, so that I forget what the N stands for. Do you remember? And it's pigmented. It meets the green criteria, and it's now the premium. Doesn't that refer to the number of coats rather than the quality of paint? Yeah. So when it says an MPI system, that means that it's got 2 finish coats rather than 1.
Right.
What do they call the one?
Well, it's actually 2 coats versus 3 coats. The basic system is the 2-coat system, and then the premium system is the.
So it's basic and premium.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, this is kind of the outcome, and then the numbers in the far right column under the MP refer to the actual constituent components, the paint itself, as opposed to the system code over here on the left.
Right.
So that's what that looks like, and then you can try to. That's what I got confused and called my favorite local paint guy, and he helped me come up with some systems. And here's an example where we took we're using some of the MPI concepts about a system, but we've taken it a step further, and we've selected 3 competitive proprietary products. And one of the things that surprised me was that on a number of the paint systems, what we're actually want to accomplish is not strictly speaking per the MPI standards. So you want to talk about that a little bit, Kent?
Yeah, that's one of the things with MPI is he has pre-selected systems for you. And as I've said numerous times in our conversations, it depends in terms of what you want to achieve. And a lot of times some of their systems will give you a 2 finish coat option versus putting a prime coat in there. And the other thing about MPI, it doesn't allow you to write 4-coat systems. There's not a methodology unless you go outside of writing MPI systems. Let's say that you wanted to write a prime coat, an intermediate coat, and 2 finish coats. You have either a 2-coat system available to you or a 3-coat system available to you under the INT and the EXT standards. So you will have to go outside of MPI per se to be able to write those. Now you can still pull the MPI numbers in and do all those things and still keep it compliant with an MPI government spec, if you will, but that would be something that you'd have to go outside of their systems to actually write. And that's what we kind of did here with this particular system by putting the MPI number 3, putting that prime coat in there on cementitious siding, and then coming in with 2 finish coats. We actually modified that system to a certain degree to give that prime coat and to give a better adhesion value and to give it another coat of durability factor built into this particular system.
And one of the reasons.
And Louis, I would have
sir.
a question for you, because I see what you've done with the spec, but at this point you've already selected the products that you want. Why do you need the MPI number at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. It does, in some cases, of course, if we were doing work for the federal government, they would want to see it. The other thing is that if somebody wants to try to come in with a substitution for a regional brand of paint in another part of the country, because we do work all across the country, that gives me a little more something that I can go to evaluate to see whether they really are an equivalent paint. Is it on the approved list one, and then we can try to figure out whether it's an equivalent to the actual proprietary products.
Okay, so I have a comment here that might play into that from Steve Groth.
Yes.
Who's saying specifying by MPI number doesn't address the manufacturer's good, better, or best level products.
No, we're going to talk about that in the last slide, but yes.
Okay.
Well, in this particular situation, we have addressed the good, better, best aspect of it, because we have chosen equal products from 3 different manufacturers and put them into the specification. So we've established a level of quality by the proprietary method that we've used here, and also by comparing those 3 different manufacturers' products and put them into a circumstance where we don't end up getting something out of MPI number 15 or MPI number 3 that's a lesser quality than what we want.
But if you go to the master spec sections for these systems, they will have these MPI system numbers in there, but they also have a place to plug in the proprietary products that you might want. So it is a kind of a combination. One of the good things about the MPI system that really is very good, and people used it for many years starting back in the 80s. Even if they didn't use the MPI system for the paint selection, they used the designation of the gloss levels, the sheen, because it was really the first time that somebody sat down and figured that out in a rational way that could be scientifically evaluated, so that what one paint company calls satin, somebody else might call eggshell, and they're not really. Are they the same? Are they different? So there was a basis for objective evaluation. But you're quite right. Once the MPI numbers here are just kind of an extra thing, and do they do any good? Who knows?
Okay.
So, yes, David.
No, I'm just commenting because I haven't seen that approach that you were using necessarily, and it was I was just curious your rationale. So thanks for the explanation.
Yeah, in the past we've done the pure proprietary thing, but then of course, Master Spec used to have 2 different versions of their paint specs. They did one that was pure MPI, and they did one that was pure proprietary. And they actually listed proprietary products from the major manufacturers around the country. But they've stopped doing that. And so why do I do it? I don't know. We'll see. We may go back to a pure proprietary.
Keep us posted.
Say again?
Keep us posted.
Okay, so some of the advantages are, as I said, they really did do a super job of standardizing the sheen levels, and there's a certain level of terminology on other things that is helpful, because there are categories for exterior waterborne on certain kinds of surfaces. It does give you some sort of objective standard to describe those things. And they do a certain level of objective evaluation of the individual products. Bubba and Tyrone in their garage may not be able to mix up a bucket of paint that will pass the muster. And we've talked about it being required for some government projects, especially federal work in particular.
Yeah, and the MPI is built into virtually all of the federal master specifications, so you really have no choice since you're required to use those specs as a start point.
Yeah, we're starting a project soon that's going to have to use specs intact, so I guess I'm going to have to learn even more about MPI than I know at present, but I know who to talk to. On the other hand, I don't know if you noticed, but back on the slide for the fluorocarbon coatings, it noted that MPI does not have any systems for fluorocarbon. What are some of the other areas where they're sort of missing?
Well, they're heavy with alkyd systems, and again, when we're talking about VOC compliancy and so on, we have to be real careful about not using alkyd systems per se on lead projects and things of that nature. So you have to be a little bit careful about some of the systems that you choose there. The biggest issue with MPI probably is the fact that we manufacturers can list more than one product in an individual category. And as you list here, it says on here that, usually results in a medium grade material. More to the point, it normally ends up being the least expensive product in that category, unless there are some safeguards such as what we had there with the 3 proprietary products listed, where you would choose those 3 as being approved for your particular project out of that specific category. So that would be something that is one of my pet peeves, if you want to call it that, about MPI, is the fact that you have multiple choices in that category, in some of those categories, that can create for less than the level of quality that you may want to establish for your project.
Which is an issue in terms of the competition to try to, because we as specifiers always want to bid apples against apples and not apples against oranges, and so that's always an issue.
Exactly.
And if you're not a subscriber to Master Spec or BSD Spec Link, there is an additional cost. I don't know. Do you know what that is?
I don't know, and I think it's depending upon whether you're buying the software, if you're doing this BSD Spec Link or you're doing Master Spec of that nature. I know that we subscribe and we buy so many seats on it, our company every year. I don't know the exact amount that we pay for that, though.
All right. Well,
okay, so Louis, we're right up against the hour.
Yes, but let me just finish that thought on the software.
Okay.
That only has to do with if you want to use their web-based software to spit out a list, that you can export into Excel or something like that. There's plenty of free information. That's why they have 2 websites. So there's plenty of information on the systems and the individual paints that make up those systems there. So yes, we're right up on the hour.
So, and I see from Dwayne Epp and Lee Kilborn, we're coming right back to the initial question. So how do we specify the best paint quality level using MPI? I don't know that we have a firm answer. And Lee is asking, why not just ask for MPI institutional grade?
Well, and you could do that. The only issue is that really the level of quality that you want for a particular project? Each project is a standalone normally, and you don't necessarily want to say one thing that would be either over specification or under specification for what project type that you're dealing with. So it's still very important that you know about paint quality and know what are equal products in categories. Because again, and the submittal process is probably where this becomes extremely important too. Because if you leave a category wide open, as we've stated a time or two, then you're allowing for the least expensive product to be used on your project.
Let me give you an example. If you're doing an apartment building where typically the interior walls of the units are painted with something that's not real expensive. We usually use the good line rather than the better or the best. Partly because the inhabitants are going to repaint. It's going to be repainted when they move out and somebody else comes in, and so there's just not a lot of point in putting in something that has a high scrubbability and good service life. So if you use the MPI system, you wouldn't need to name names. Just you'll get whatever is cost effective in that system. On the other hand, if you're doing a hospital where they are going to scrub down the walls from time to time, and they are going to take care of it, and they do want a long service life, then you're going to have to augment the MPI system with proprietary names. There's just no way around it. So I hope people are not more confused after this session than not. But you know, I think in some ways it's a good first step. You know, when I started out being a full-time specifier in the early 1980s, I just used to say, man, I wish there were ASTM standards for the paints. But there aren't. There probably never will be. Maybe MPI will eventually evolve into that if they get enough pressure from the marketplace. We'll find out.
Okay, and here's a good one to finish with. Robert Bauman, okay? He's solving the problem that some of us are probably asking. Right, so master spec, those master spec users out there, if you want access to MPI, open up the spec section, master spec section. There's a comment in blue. Turn on hidden text to make sure he can see it. That includes a link to MPI through Arcom Spec Builder, and that's how you can access it.
Yes. Yeah, that uses their paragraph builder software that, well, you have to install Masterworks.
Yes.
Which is the software that comes with Master Spec. And sometimes it works, and sometimes there are problems. I have mixed feelings about it.
So we'll leave it at that. But that gives place to folks. Everyone now knows at least how to go and look for it.
Yes.
So, Kent, thanks so much for joining us again this month. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for asking me to come another month. I consider this quite an honor. Thank you so much.
And what are we going to talk about next month, David?
Well, we're going to explore specifications and keynoting and how we might be able to look at helping the drawing and spec coordination. We have a couple of ideas that we want to share. Maybe you folks have some ideas as to how you're actually implementing it today. And if you want to share those ideas with us, we'll see what we can do to get everybody's ideas incorporated into the presentation and bat this around next month.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. And we appreciate your attendance. And if you have suggestions for things that we might talk about in the coming new year, David and I have talked about doing a session on insulating glass. And, of course, today we even came up with the idea of maybe. So if you've got some ideas or preferences, let us know, because we really want this to be your group and not just ours.